Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Cato Free Speech Debate. My name is Jennifer Huddleston, and I'm a Senior Fellow in Technology Policy here at the Cato Institute. Before I introduce our topic and our debaters tonight, a few quick housekeeping reminders. For those of you joining us in person in Cato's auditorium, if you could please take this time to ensure that you have silenced your cell phones so that they don't disrupt tonight's debate. And for those of you both in the auditorium and online, we will be selecting 2 audience questions at one point in this debate. Those questions can be submitted online, either on the Cato event webpage, Facebook, YouTube, or on X, using the hashtag Cato Events and Cato Technology. Today's digital age has opened more opportunities for speech than ever before. Thanks to the rise of many social media platforms as well as other venues for user-generated content, there are more opportunities for more speakers to reach more audiences than in a previous era. But this has also given rise to new questions about free expression and about the role of the First Amendment. These debates have become increasingly relevant over the last few years. So tonight, we're very glad to be joined by 2 distinguished scholars of the First Amendment who will be debating the resolution, "Contemporary understandings of the First Amendment are the best way to protect free expression in our digital age." Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marianne Franks, the Eugene L. and Barbara A. Bernard Professor in Intellectual Property, Technology, and Civil Rights Law at the George Washington University School of Law, and author of the books Fearless Speech and the Cult of the Constitution. And Robert Kornrevier, the Chief Counsel of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, the author of The Mind of the Censor and the Eye of the Beholder, and a noted First Amendment lawyer. Please join me. As noted, the resolution tonight is this: the contemporary understandings of the First Amendment are the best way to protect free expression in the digital age. Bob, as the affirmative, you may begin your opening statement with 8 minutes now.
Jennifer, thank you. It's always great to be back at Cato Institute in this beautiful facility. Dr. Franks, it's great to see you again. And thank all of you for coming out tonight. But I have to ask, couldn't we at least have talked about something more timely? I mean, after all, I read that Jane Fonda is reorganizing the McCarthy-era Committee for the First Amendment. How very 1950s, how retro. But I guess I shouldn't complain whenever progressives rediscover the virtues of the First Amendment. That's a good thing, right? Now, if only we can get the conservatives who are in power to do the same thing. Now, speaking of retro, when I was leaving the FCC in 1994 to return to private practice and look for ways to develop a First Amendment practice, I was worried. I thought all of the great First Amendment cases had been done and that there wouldn't be any really opportunity to practice First Amendment law in earnest. But who knew? 30 years later, the First Amendment is on the front pages of every newspaper in America, although there's a retro reference for you as well. It's filling the court's dockets, and it is the topic that we're here tonight to discuss tonight. And as Jennifer mentioned, the proposition is this: are contemporary understandings of the First Amendment the best way to protect free expression in the 21st century? And it should surprise no one here tonight or who's watching online that my answer to that question is an emphatic yes. Now, before we understand what yes means, I think it's important to define our terms a little bit. When we're talking about contemporary understandings of the First Amendment, whose understandings are we talking about? Are we talking about the Stanford Law School students who heckled and shouted down Judge Duncan from the Fifth Circuit and described that as the exercise of their First Amendment rights? Or are we talking about the Trump administration that began with great fanfare with an executive order saying that free speech is back and purporting to prohibit any federal official from violating private speech rights? Of course, since then, they've been working overtime to revoke the visa of any student who wrote an op-ed they dislike, or threaten FCC licensees with revocation if they aren't sufficiently effusive about the chief executive. I could go on with more examples, but I only have 8 minutes. Now, neither of those is a description of the contemporary understandings that I'm talking about tonight. My argument is based on the law of the First Amendment as it developed after the first third of the 20th century and through the current time. I'll also talk about the broader concept, if there's time, of the culture of free expression. But let me focus on the law, and I'll begin with a couple of caveats. One, I'm not suggesting that First Amendment doctrine has been perfect. The courts are human institutions after all, and I don't agree with every aspect of First Amendment law. And secondly, I'm not claiming that the Supreme Court started soon enough in trying to define what the First Amendment protects. It wasn't until 1931 that the Supreme Court reached its first decision actually protecting First Amendment rights. But what I'm saying is that once the Supreme Court started on that endeavor, it put us on the road for a greater degree of protections of speech. Now, with the Constitution at my back, I'll describe why I think this is the best way to protect free expression. And it's based on 3 core tenets of First Amendment law. The first is that under U.S. law, all speech is presumptively protected, and the exceptions are few, narrow, and strictly defined. Now, you're probably familiar with the unprotected categories as people have talked about them. There are certain kinds of speech like incitement to imminent lawless action, true threats, speech integral to crime, defamation, fraud, images of child sexual abuse, and obscenity. But it's a little bit of a misnomer to describe these as unprotected categories. Over time, the Supreme Court and lower courts have set the rules for or constitutionalized those areas so that before the government can push speech off the edge of the First Amendment earth, it must meet a stringent test. And in that, the government always has the burden of proof to show that speech is unprotected, and it's never the speaker's burden to prove the merit of their speech. Because of this first tenet, some categories have dropped out, like commercial speech used to be considered unprotected speech, and the tests for the remaining categories have tightened over the years. And the result of that is that protected speech has expanded over time, while censorship has contracted. The second tenet, what constitutes speech, is defined broadly to include all forms of expression and as well as the speech process. So it includes words and music, symbolic expression, not just speech about political topics, but about, let's say, music or art with no discernible meaning or message. So the Supreme Court has said that art, including the art of Jackson Pollock or Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, are protected under the First Amendment. And it includes not just the expression of speech, but also its creation, the gathering information, its dissemination, and the reception of speech. And most importantly, it includes the right not to speak. This means that the First Amendment protects such things as the right to burn an American flag in protest, although someone needs to inform the President and Attorney General Bondi of that fact. Third tenet, the First Amendment is and must be neutral. If there is any principle that is near absolute in First Amendment law, it's this, that the government cannot play favorites when it comes to different viewpoints. There simply is no government interest in doing so. Because of that, the Supreme Court and the First Amendment protects Black Lives Matter, as well as the organizers of the Unite the Right rally. It protects those who advocate for gender ideology as well as those who oppose it. And it protects those who advocate for reproductive choice and the speech of those who want to limit it. Now, I'll add one final tenet, although it's more of a principle of application than a tenet of First Amendment law. And that is, the First Amendment has moved in the direction of being technology neutral. This is something that has changed over time. The Supreme Court reached sort of an outlier decision when it came to broadcasting. But over the last half of the 20th century, it has recognized that the other technologies of film, film, cable television, the internet, and interactive video games receive full First Amendment protection. Now, I understand that no battle is ever fully won, and the arc of history thus far, in this country at least, has bent toward greater protection. Right now, the First Amendment is under great stress, and now is the time to recommit to those principles. You have to be able to answer the question, what power would you trust the government with over speech if you put it in the hands of your worst enemy? I think adhering to these principles has proven to be the best answer to that question.
Thank you. Mary Ann, your opening statement.
Thank you, and thank you, Bob. I'll start with some of the things that I think Bob and I agree about, which are that we have to define what we mean by contemporary understandings of the First Amendment before we can say whether they are the best way to protect free expression currently. And I think there's also some overlap in what I think we would both maybe say is the core of the First Amendment, as the doctrine would have us understand as opposed to understandings of the First Amendment, because I think one of the most profound problems that we have right now is that we have a real gap between the understanding of what the First Amendment actually says versus what the popular understanding of the First Amendment is. The one that I think really is the core is the idea that the government is not supposed to be able to control how people think. That is, the government should not be able to punish you for your opinions, and the government also cannot force you to have certain opinions. That seems to be the core of the First Amendment. There are other protections, there are other complexities, but that really is the heart of the First Amendment, and it is, I think, a non-negotiable part of the First Amendment, which means that if we do start talking about free speech culture, if we start talking about expanding the First Amendment, one thing we have to be very cautious about is that we're not eroding that principal belief and that principal protection, which is protection from the government in terms of our opinions. So, if we're asking ourselves whether the First Amendment, as it is understood, is protecting us, we have to ask right now, are we protected from government interference with our opinions? And as Bob mentioned, we can just look around us and understand that that is not the case. When the President of the United States is deploying the National Guard to cities to put down protests, then we are not in a situation where we are free from government censorship. When we are being told by the President of the United States that it is appropriate to single out, to surveil, to arrest and try to deport students because of things that they have said, when the President of the United States says, because a beloved pundit has died, that it's the responsibility of everyone who didn't like him, and that the people who are criticizing that person after his death should be violently assaulted. The president saying this. When members of his administration are saying we're going to strip the visas from people who have said things that are inappropriately patriotic or in some ways dissent from the government's position. When the president purports to have the authority to tell universities that they can't talk about certain concepts anymore. When he takes books out of libraries and says those are ideas that we can't talk about anymore. When he says that he's going to control the press by suing them over and over again, but also by making them their access to this kind of information from the press pool contingent on basically loyalty oaths. When he asks his AG to bring RICO cases against protesters who yelled at him in a restaurant and has doubled down on the idea that they should have to go to jail, and thinks that perhaps broadcasters that air coverage of him that is too negative, that their licenses should be taken away. This is just a partial list. If we are in this moment with a president who has said, as Bob pointed out, that he is bringing back the First Amendment to the United States, he is restoring freedom of expression, we have to ask, what is his understanding of the First Amendment? Because that is the understanding that matters most. And I would not, I think this is where I would diverge from Bob, I would not want to put that alongside student protesters on a university campus because they are not the government. They are not where the threat is coming from. They are not equivalent threats to freedom of expression. And part of the reason why the President of the United States feels comfortable in engaging in an outright censorship, oppressive regime against every idea that he does not like is partly due to the narrative that we have had in this country for about a decade or so. It's cyclical, but especially in the last 10 years or so, that attempts to shift this kind of power narrative. 10 years or so of a narrative that says, you know who the real censors are? Students. You know where the real problem with threats to free speech comes from? Intolerant professors. Do you know what the real issue when it comes to censorship is? It's whether or not Twitter can ban the president. That has been the narrative for a decade that has completely blown past that distinction between government control and private control. And it's not just a matter of expanding the First Amendment and saying, let's have some principles outside of the First Amendment. It's reversing it. Because every time you say, no, those are the censors, the students, the social media, the professors, what you are not looking at is what the government is doing at the same time, censoring ideas, banning books, responding with violence to dissent. And not only are you not looking at the government when they are engaged in that censorship activity, when you say, let's talk about the free speech college campus crisis, you're also setting things up so that you can justify the crackdown of the government on those very woke or leftist indoctrinating institutions. What's the justification for all of that? Why does Trump think that he can do this? Because he's confident that he has now managed to take advantage of a narrative that says the real censors are students and leftists and protesters and all those people, and therefore the only way to save free speech is to be a censor. Is for the government to come and regulate, for the government to force ideological diversity, to force us to listen to ideas that we don't want to listen to. That becomes the justification. So it isn't just eroding that distinction, it becomes a diversion tactic and it becomes a justification tactic. And it also manages to have a really broad popular appeal because it feels right. If you don't know what the First Amendment really says, if we're just going on vibes about the First Amendment, it feels like, well, if I am blocked from Twitter or someone doesn't want to listen to me on the street, maybe it feels like censorship, but it isn't. It actually isn't. And the idea that we would start disabling our concerns and our red flag systems and our worries about the government encroaching upon our lives because we're being sold this propaganda that says, oh, really the real enemy here is intolerant individuals or intolerant private platforms. That is a real danger. And then we're also told that, well, we have to make sure that this tolerance idea, this kind of vulgar constitutionalism idea that we think the First Amendment might translate into, which is more speech is always better speech. There's no such thing as bad speech, or at least nothing that can't be resolved by just having more of it. And we're told that it protects everybody equally, right? It protects Black Lives Matter and it protects the KKK equally. But does it? We definitely know that it's going to protect the KKK. We have cases that show that, right? What about Black Lives Matter? What about DeRay McKesson, who has been in litigation for 8 years over a protest that he organized and had nothing to do with the violence that supposedly broke out and supposedly a rock that was thrown at a police officer. But for 8 years, DeRay McKesson has had to fight to say that is not something that you can sue me for without violating the First Amendment. Now, DeRay McKesson's pretty famous, and he's got the ACLU on his side. He's got great lawyers. It's still taking 8 years, and it still hasn't been resolved. So when we say, oh, we have to protect all of the speech today, right, whether it's white supremacists or whether it's white supremacists, because it's almost always white supremacists, the idea is, well, it's going to come back around. It's going to protect everyone. And then what happens? When it comes back around, it doesn't actually protect everyone. It doesn't actually protect everybody equally. And historically speaking, that's always been true. Even if we want to cherry pick cases and say these are the good moments where the First Amendment was really protected, our long history has said over and over again, the First Amendment protects some speakers more than others. That has always been the case. And if you don't pay attention to questions of power, especially government power, you end up exactly where we are right now, which is in a very deadly and dangerous moment for free speech.
Thank you. I'm sure you both have heard some things in each other's opening statements that you want to either rebut or just generally respond to. So at this point, I'll ask Bob if you will return to your podium and give a 4-minute response or rebuttal.
Thanks, Jennifer. Well, I guess my reaction is I'm still waiting for the debate to begin. You remember those several tenets I laid out of principles of First Amendment law? Those are the ones that I'm defending, not misunderstandings or people who are being hypocrites about about their defense of free speech or the First Amendment. I listened to a laundry list of things that the Trump administration is doing, and it sounds like a list of Fire's greatest hits. Those are the very cases that we're taking when students are being threatened with having their visas removed or being deported. We're in court against the Secretary of State trying to find that that is unconstitutional. We have defended against book censorship. We have defended cases where the president is suing private individuals. All of those are First Amendment problems. Doesn't matter which administration is involved. When the Biden administration was leaning on social media companies to restrict speech or change their moderation processes for COVID-related information or disinformation, that's something that we filed in court to say violates the First Amendment. So regardless of which administration is in power, the answer is to apply those First Amendment principles that I described earlier. Now, as I said, this is a process, and over time it evolves, and it evolves into stronger protections for the First Amendment. Professor Frank says that, well, Black Lives Matter has been in litigation for 8 years. Well, yeah, those of us who litigate know that litigation takes a while. I've represented, actually my first case for fire involved representing a student who had been wrongfully expelled. That took 8 years, 2 trips to the Court of Appeals. That's the way litigation works, but in the end, you end up with decisions that solidify those protections of the First Amendment. And they, over time, create a stronger body of doctrine that does protect against those actions that we complain about. Now, the one thing that I will take a strong issue with in Professor Frank's statement is her claim that the First Amendment protects some people more than it does others. And I read that statement in her book, but if you actually look at the cases that she describes in her book, she simply leaves out that part of the history where the First Amendment was used to further the civil rights movement, women's rights, gay rights, and so on. So if you have a complete history of the First Amendment, you find that applying those 4 tenets that I described earlier leaves us stronger and free expression more protected.
Thank you. Marianne, your rebuttal or response?
Thank you, Bob, for mentioning my book, because it gives me an opportunity to talk about why my book is about what it's about, which is about the people who have spoken out fearlessly and courageously throughout history who were not protected by the First Amendment. And that is why a lot of the book focuses on periods of time. As Bob has said, he is very much focused on a narrow slice of First Amendment history, because if we look at the First Amendment for more than 100 years, it really wasn't doing anything for people in terms of their individual rights. That's a lot of time. That's a lot of our history. The history that I talk about in my book is the history of abolitionism, of the people who would take abolitionist literature and burn it and ban it, of the people who had to fight against abolitionist mobs, had their newspaper presses burnt to the ground, who were shot to death by angry mobs, about the women who were advocating for women's rights who were being arrested in front of the White House. I'm talking about all those cases because the First Amendment didn't actually protect them. There's a story we can tell about free speech, which is a story about people taking risks to actually move our country forward in terms of equality and protection and civil rights. Sometimes that overlaps with certain First Amendment cases. Sometimes it does. There's no denying that's the case. But for most of our history and the most bold and courageous speakers, it has not been about the law at all. It has simply been about people who are willing to put everything on the line for their speech. That's how we've gotten most of the progress in this country. Now, lawyers, I think, are very fond of talking about cases and saying, well, litigation takes a long time. I'm also a lawyer. I'm aware that it takes time. But what I'm concerned about is, what does that mean for the average person then? To be told, well, maybe in 10 years, if you have enough money, if you have the resources, if fire likes you, maybe you can end up in court and maybe you can be vindicated and everything will be fine. Well, then what happens to what we sometimes call in the First Amendment world the chilling effect? What happens in the meantime, even assuming that all those things happen? What happens when the state is already told your teachers can't say these words or your businesses can't have these concepts? What happens in the meantime when you discipline and cow people to believe that they're going to be punished by the state if they engage in this type of behavior? We could look at our cases and say, look, they took so long, but we got really good results. Or we could look at our history and say, why do legislators keep passing these really unconstitutional laws and forcing people to have to come to court and try to fight to be vindicated over and over and over again. If Brandenburg really did protect Black Lives Matter future speaking as much as it did the KKK, why wasn't it clear after Brandenburg that what happened to DeRay McKesson shouldn't have happened? Litigation is important, it's a piece of the puzzle, but it does not mean that the average person trying to speak does not have to worry about whether or not they're going to be deported, about whether or not they're going to be arrested, about whether or not they're going to be on the receiving end of actual physical violence because the president told someone to assault them. So it's not an either or. Litigation happens. Lawyers are great. But I don't think the true story about freedom of speech in this country is about the lawyers. I think it's actually about the speakers. I think it's actually about people who didn't have the privilege of lawyers and had the backing of nonprofit organizations that have a lot of money. I think it's actually about the people who took real risks. Now, the law hasn't done a very good job of actually protecting them, and the fact that we keep needing to have those people to move the ball forward means that we are doing a very bad job. If the First Amendment means anything, it's supposed to serve as a restraint upon government to not violate our rights over and over and over again. Again, I will simply gesture at the world we are living in. What restraint do we think that this government has? Is this government worried about getting sued? Is this government worried about losing in court? Or is this government ruthlessly trying to suppress dissent? And is it winning? That, I think, is the real question.
Thank you very much. Bob, if you could return to your podium, we're going to move on to the question and answer portion of tonight's debate. As I mentioned, we will be taking 2 questions that are based on the audience submitted questions that our speakers have not seen before. But our first 2 questions, our speakers were sent a few weeks in advance to be able to prepare for tonight's debate. So the first question is this, and Marianne will respond first, followed by Bob. The First Amendment protects significant amounts of speech that might be deemed lawful but awful. Should society, platforms, or the law do anything about such concerns, and how should the First Amendment respond to concerns about such?
Thank you. Lawful but awful. The answer, I think, to that question is, should they, is the wrong question. They already are. There's really one of the misunderstandings, one of the gaps between rhetoric and reality, I think, when it comes to the First Amendment, is that we seem to think we have this free-floating, anybody can say whatever they want at any time, which is really not what the First Amendment says. And again, not for ideological reasons, just for orderliness reasons, right? The fact that we're having this debate, this discussion means that while I'm talking and Bob is talking, no one else is talking, but no one's being censored, no one's being stifled. It means that we're having an orderly discussion. So any organization, any platform, any space that actually wants to have meaningful discussions will already have ground rules, it will have regulations, it will have steps to take, it will have standards if we're lucky, and that will be a good thing, because otherwise all there is chaos. And so I don't think the answer is, should they? They already are, and we do this all of the time. There's a deeper question about what should those standards look like, especially when it comes to difficult, controversial issues. And that, I do think, requires some debate. But I also think that we need to remind ourselves that even the First Amendment is heavily dependent on context. The kinds of rights that you might have in the middle of the street are not the same rights you would have at work. The kinds of things that you can say to a family member are not the kinds of things that you can say to a subordinate. It's very much a contingent question. So if part of what we want to learn is how do we deal with tough speech questions when it comes to certain communities and certain institutions, I think we first have to ask ourselves, well, what is the point of that institution? What is the point of that particular community? And then we can answer some difficult questions about what we value and what kinds of speech we want to promote as opposed to prohibit, as opposed to permit. And those are the harder and more subtle questions that we should ask.
Bob, your response?
But awful speech depends on context. I'll agree with Professor Franks in that regard, but it depends on who you're asking and what they're supposed to do. If the question is how society should respond to lawful but awful speech, the response is to respond with counter speech, not to shout down the speaker, not to use the heckler's veto, but to respond with your own words. That's how the First Amendment works. If the question is how social media platforms should respond to lawful but awful speech, the answer is to adopt moderation policies that are consistent with the community you are trying to create with your platform. And also, don't give in to government jawboning about the application of those moderation policies. And if the question is how the government should respond to awful but lawful speech, the answer is to protect that speech based on neutral principles, which is what First Amendment doctrine is based on.
Thank you. Our second question, I'll begin with Bob and then turn to Mary Ann. Mechanisms beyond the First Amendment often come into play when we're discussing the broader culture of free expression, particularly online today. How do you respond to concerns about a heckler's veto that might stifle speech or limit certain discussion online? And how might First Amendment law support or push back against these concerns?
Again, it depends on context. First, it's important to recognize that cancel culture actually is a thing. It violates the culture of free expression that tolerates views that are contrary to yours. It is not, as Professor Franks has argued, a neo-Confederate fantasy designed to distract us from actual government censorship. It does happen where you have mobs coming online to silence people they don't like, also in the literal world as well. Now keep in mind, the First Amendment does not protect acts of violence, true threats, or violations of university policies when students shout down a speaker. And finally, the First Amendment precludes the government from getting involved and putting its thumb on the scale. So for example, if people in this administration think that certain people online have been insufficiently respectful of Charlie Kirk, it is not their place under the First Amendment to pressure anyone to have the right attitude or to advocate firing people for that attitude. That's what the First Amendment protects.
Mary Ann?
Heckler's veto. That one's a tough one, right? Because heckler's veto actually is, in some ways, counter-speech, right? The idea that someone is going to violently, that is to say, violently in terms of their language, not violently physically, because we can distinguish easily between speech and conduct. But if someone has a real objection to someone else's speech, why isn't that kind of shouting, right? Why isn't it also counter-speech? Now we can say that, well, the rule is you can't silence anybody else. Well, then that just leads us to more questions about, well, why is the speaker the first person to have that right and the other person's placed in a subordinate position? Why is it a question of letting somebody have a platform and then insisting that they have to keep that platform no matter what they say, even if other people want to speak at the same time? And we might say that that might be a better rule because we like civility or we want to have things to be more orderly, but that isn't something that really distinguishes between counter-speech and not counter-speech. I think it's also worth pointing out that some things are not responsive to counter-speech. If someone publishes a naked photo of you without your consent, how do you speak back to that? If someone is going to publish your private health data, how are you going to speak back to that exactly? So I think we have to really wrestle with those questions because what happens online very often is you have anonymous mobs. I would agree that anonymous mobs do exist, but they're usually targeting people who are already quite vulnerable, and they're targeting people for all kinds of things, maybe not so much their viewpoints, such as their race and their gender and their supposed identity. That's been going on for pretty much ever. And the right way to try to handle that would be to actually take seriously the fact that people are being truly harmed and have some kind of distinctions, objectively speaking, between people being criticized or people who are even being told that they should be fired versus people who are getting death threats versus people who are actually going to suffer seriously, physically or otherwise. So let's have some standards about that and actually have some real questions about what it is we want to create an online healthy environment that would actually be productive for dialogue and discourse.
We've had a great number of audience questions submitted both before and during this event. I'm going to kind of identify some general trends and rephrase in my own words for our next two questions. And these are questions, as I mentioned, that our speakers have not seen in advance. And I'll be beginning with Bob for the first question, which is this. The First Amendment is rather uniquely American. While there are cultures of free expression all around the world, this sort of legal protection is rather unique to the US. What can we learn from other countries or other views of free expression that support the importance of the First Amendment or might lead to questions around what would happen in a world without the First Amendment?
Well, thank you. That is an excellent question, and it ties back into the basic tenets of First Amendment law that I think are unique to America, where speech is presumptively protected except in certain specific categories. Compare that to protections under the European Convention of Human Rights, where Article 10 generally protects free expression, but then is riddled with exceptions. And then speech, even if it doesn't meet one of those exceptions, can be removed from protection under Article 17 if it's considered to be an abuse of those rights. And so if you compare the US and Europe, you'll find that while we have limited categories of unprotected speech, Europe has open-ended categories. While we have strict scrutiny, Europe uses something called proportionality, which is a form of balancing. Here in the United States, the Supreme Court has held that we need to have breathing space for free speech, meaning you err on the side of protecting speech, whereas in Europe, the government has accorded what the courts in Europe cheekily call a margin of appreciation, which gives them quite a bit of latitude for mischief. Here in the United States, speech intermediaries are protected in their moderation decisions, whereas in Europe, those mediaries might not be protected. The primary example of the difference between European law and US law is what we call hate speech, which is an amorphous concept that is really a matter of perspective. Now, I'm sure Professor Franks will tell us about vulnerable groups and hate speech, and they need to be protected from that. But the Attorney General thinks that being insufficiently respectful of Charlie Kirk is hate speech. You really have to decide who you're going to trust to decide which hateful speech you're going to empower the government to restrict. We've seen Europe as a test case in this regard. In Europe, under the European Convention of Human Rights, there are hate speech laws. And so, for example, in England and Wales, there were 12,000 arrests in 2023 alone for communications that were considered to be hateful, and 11,000 convictions. We see the same thing in Germany. 60 Minutes recently had an episode where it followed a German police unit who was tasked with watching communications online to see who they should arrest for having the wrong opinion. So we've seen a test case of the difference between American law and European law, and American law, frankly, is superior.
Marianne.
The United States is ranked 21st out of 161 countries in Article 19's Global Expression Report. That is well behind many European countries. It's ranked 57th out of 180 countries in the Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Index, coming far behind many, many countries, including Germany and the United Kingdom, and actually also after Liberia, Romania, and Sierra Leone. One of the really unique things about the United States and the First Amendment is our belief that we're really good at this. We really do have the belief that we are uniquely really good at free speech. And I think one of the troubling aspects of that belief is that we have this sense that it is really hard for us to catch up with reality, really hard for us to understand that every time we say things like, oh, do you see what they did in Germany the other day? And just really not thinking about, let's just walk outside for a moment. Find a National Guard officer who's standing on the street wanting to see whether you're going to do something to piss off the president, right? The idea that we keep thinking over there, they just haven't figured it out. We have got it all figured out. So no, I don't like hate speech laws because I don't know what that means. I'm a law professor, I like to define things. But if the idea is that Europe somehow has got the wrong end of the stick because they've got this concept where they want to confront values such as autonomy and privacy, and they want to think about those values, I'm not so sure that we should be so confident, especially right this moment, that we want to lecture other countries about how well you really aren't doing free speech the way you should. Perhaps it is time for us to stop idealizing what we think the First Amendment should be and actually look at how it is working in practice. How is it working in practice? How free are we to speak without the government threatening us with punishment? The answer is we're not particularly free, then maybe there are some things we could learn from other countries. So I do think that this should be, if nothing else, a humbling moment. If our First Amendment was not enough to keep us from sliding into totalitarianism, then what was it good for? And if it isn't working, because it clearly isn't protecting us from those tendencies in that path, now is the time for us to do something different.
For our second question, I'll start with Marianne before turning to Bob. And this question was asked both in the specific context of online platforms as well as in a broader context of private institutions more generally, which is this: can private institutions violate the First Amendment, or can they engage in censorship? If so, when do you feel that occurs?
As a matter of First Amendment law, private actors, that is to say non-government actors, cannot violate the First Amendment. They can be subjected to pressures by the government, and if the government has acted in a way that is essentially trying to engage in that kind of pressure, this is called censorship by proxy or job owning, then what can happen as a result is, yes, there's censorship that occurs, but properly speaking, that's the government that is engaged in that behavior, not the intermediary who is a non-government actor. When we start to talk about maybe the looser sense of censorship, right, because I do think it's important for us to define what does the First Amendment actually keep us tied to versus what do we think we might want to expand from that. Many people want to expand it to say, well, yes, okay, it's not violating the First Amendment, but it's free speech culture. It's not a good thing when a platform or a private actor, especially a really powerful one, eliminates speech. And I would say that may be true. That might be a valid point. But it's a very one-sided point, because if you're concerned about the influence that a private actor has over speech, you should be as concerned about what they are putting in front of you as what they're taking away. Private actors are not motivated by democracy or freedom of speech or civil liberties. They are motivated, if we're speaking about social media platforms, by profit. So the idea that we're going to depend on any of these private actors as kind of our free speech spaces, I think is already a pretty sad indictment of what we are expecting from our free speech spaces. But we do need to demand better things from them on all counts. If we don't like what is happening there, I'm much more moved by the idea that the amount of, let's say, white supremacist content on X, or the amount of CSAM that is now on X after they have relaxed their controls against child sexual abuse material, that those things are really concerning, and possibly more concerning than the fact that occasionally an account might be suspended or something might happen that removes speech. This is what I meant, again, about this kind of crude version, or this vibes version of the First Amendment is, oh, if something gets taken away, that's censorship, but if something stays, it's not. These are all choices that are being made about speech. Private actors have the right to make those choices, and it's not just that it's not censorship. Those actions, that curation, that deciding, those things are exercises of free speech itself.
Bob?
I'm looking for something to disagree with, and I'm not hearing it. The bottom line answer is clear. Private actors are not subject to the First Amendment. What people would call censorship, they call moderation or editing. And that's just a basic First Amendment principle. But there are a couple of caveats there. One is if a private actor is operating hand in glove with government actors, then that can tip the balance over into state action, but it has to be a very close relationship. And related to that is the second concept, and that's job owning, where you have the government vaguely in the shadows, sometimes out in the open, making threats about what will happen if a social media platform, for example, doesn't change its policies and start censoring content of one type or the other. And we've seen clear examples of that in both of the recent administrations. The Biden administration did that, and it ended up in the Supreme Court, with the court not ultimately reaching the merits of that case, although it did reaffirm that the First Amendment prohibits job owning, where you have a government actor leaning on a private actor to censor speech. We've also seen it recently with the Trump administration, where it's been leaning on social media platforms in a variety of manners. That violates the First Amendment too. But it's not the private actor that is violating the First Amendment without that added component.
Thank you. If you could both be seated, we'll shortly turn to our closing statements. I will ask for our audience to please hold your applause until the end, when we'll thank both of our speakers at the same time. Mary Ann, we will begin with your closing statement. You have 5 minutes.
Oh, sorry, shouldn't have sat down.
No.
Oh, got to jump back up. So the saying goes, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. So maybe history is instructive here. I'm going to go back in history a little bit. 1933, German universities. 1933 law that many of you are probably familiar with that basically purged all the faculties of non-Aryans and also anyone who was ideologically critical of the ruling regime, the Nazi regime. It meant that the universities became very censored places where many things could not be discussed. And not a single German university actually tried to resist this with any kind of real force. But students continued to have classes, they continued to talk to each other, they continued to learn new things. And in 1942, a small student group of resistors, called themselves the White Rose, decided that they were going to start trying to resist in subtle ways. They were going to write these pamphlets, and they were going to distribute them around the city, around the university, that were going to highlight the lies of the government, and it was going to highlight the wartime atrocities, and it was going to encourage people to resist the fascists. So they would crank out these pamphlets, and they would leave them in things like telephone booths and at train stations, and sometimes they would put them on university campuses, and they would graffiti the walls of the University of Munich in particular, graffiti the walls with "Down with Hitler" and freedom signs. In the summer or the fall of 1942, the White Rose third pamphlet was published. And in this pamphlet, they specifically focused on what they wanted their audience to think about and to do to resist the Nazis. And they said the answer is sabotage. They said the sabotage that we're talking about here isn't just sabotage the actual factories, the military mobilizations, but also sabotage the entire ideological landscape of fascism. So here's the quote. "Sabotage in all scholarly and intellectual realms that exist for the continuance of the current war, whether this be in universities, colleges, laboratories, research facilities, or technical offices. Sabotage at all cultural events that could possibly exalt the prestige of fascists among the people or the dissemination of the brown lie." On January 13th, 1943, University of Munich had its 470th anniversary of its founding with a keynote address by a local Nazi Party official, Gauleiter Giesler, Paul Giesler. All these local and national Nazi officials were invited. They were standing with him on the stage. SS officers were all throughout the auditorium. And the speech that Gauleiter Giesler gave was about how universities are important for the Reich, but only if they are going to do the right things, celebrate the happy things in life, which is what Hitler teaches us. And then he turned to the students and specifically addressed the male students, and he said, any of you who are still sitting here and you're not fighting on the front, you're really just losers. And then he said to all the female students, he says, you female students, you shouldn't be here at all. You should be at home making babies for the Fuhrer. He went on to say, and if you're not attractive enough to make that happen, I will be happy to have some of my underlings do it for you, and you will enjoy the experience. At this point, the students in this hall, including the students who were sitting in the main part of the auditorium, who actually had returned from the front, they'd been forced to fight, they were wounded, some of them were on crutches, everyone starts to get really agitated, and they're starting to stamp their feet, they're whistling, they're catcalling, and at the point at which Giesler insults the female students and the female students try to leave, mayhem breaks out. The people in the audience start shouting so loudly that Gauleiter Giesler cannot finish his speech. And they start beating up the SS officers who are holding the female students. It is absolute mayhem. And the students end up spilling out into the street, having a spontaneous protest, and they're linking arms and they're saying, "Free our comrades." And it's the only anti-Nazi protest that happens in public throughout the entire time that Hitler's in power. Why do I bring this up? History repeats, it doesn't rhyme. Maybe sometimes it repeats. The version of the First Amendment, or our version of free speech, that looks at an incident like this, at the protest that happens at University of Munich, and says, those students were really impolite. Those students were really intolerant. Those students should have really let that person speak. He had things to say. I would submit that that is not a version of free speech that is protective of freedom of expression. I would suggest that our inability to be able to see that what happened in that moment, that brave moment when students said, we don't care that we're not allowed to do this. We are going to rise up anyway. We are going to defy authority. I would say that the version of freedom of speech that understands that that is the message of that protest in that day, that is the version that is going to protect freedom of expression in this century.
Thank you. Bob, your closing statement?
Well, I have to say, I'm not sure talking about Nazi Germany is the most persuasive argument against First Amendment doctrine. Those are students that should have been and would be protected in this country with protections for freedom of speech. I will concede one point, and I conceded it at the beginning. The Supreme Court did not embark on the enterprise of defining First Amendment jurisprudence soon enough. It happened in the 20th century. But it was in reaction to various abuses that no longer could be ignored. For 40 years, Anthony Comstock enforced single-handedly obscenity laws that were very broadly defined and were able to be used to suppress literature, art, anything about contraceptives or birth control, anything about abortion, you name it, if it offended Anthony Comstock, it fit within the definition of obscenity at the time. It is from that experience that First Amendment law finally evolved, and you can't use the government power in that way. During World War I, there were over 2,000 prosecutions under the Espionage and Sedition Acts that were used to suppress any kind of dissent against World War I. And at first, the Supreme Court went along with that, but then began to turn the tide, and First Amendment law began to develop. And so those kinds of protest activities are protected under First Amendment doctrine. You can trace American history throughout these periods, whether you're talking about the protests during World War I, the McCarthy era, the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, the anti-war movement in the 1970s. All of those gave rise to evolution of First Amendment protections, which is why we don't have to worry about the kinds of things that happened in Nazi Germany, or I might say, in Europe today. I admit that the First Amendment is not self-enforcing. There will be abuses by government. That's always been the case. And it's the reason why the framers created these amendments, so that they could be used when they were needed against these kinds of government abuses. And so that's what, over time, as these different eras come and go, we see an evolution of stronger and stronger protections for the First Amendment. Now, this isn't just some academic debate. There are those of us who are out there on the front lines every day bringing these cases and fighting to preserve those First Amendment freedoms. And if you look back at those various eras, in the end, our protections for free expression emerged stronger. And I'll add this, that where we end up in protections for free speech isn't defined by those who give in to the pressure or give in to abuses by any administration. It is defined by those who stand up and fight back. They're the ones who write the history. And that's why I'm optimistic that free speech will ultimately be protected, notwithstanding the abuses of the current era.
Thank you. I'll ask our audience to join me in thanking both of our debaters tonight. As was mentioned in the beginning and came up throughout both of our debaters' points, this certainly is a timely and relevant topic, and it's one that I am sure both of our debaters will continue to have discussions on, as well as myself and our other scholars here at Cato. But for tonight, this will conclude our program. Those of you that are joining us in person, there will be a reception in the Winter Garden outside. Thank you.